You ever watch someone mistake your patience for weakness? It's a specific kind of quiet tragedy. I lived on 40 acres of dirt and memory, completely off the grid of the new suburban hellscape next door. But the HOA president decided my pasture was her personal shortcut. She ignored the signs, laughed at the police, and eventually drove 5 SUVs full of her friends right through my property. So, I let the earth swallow them whole. Stick around for this one. The dirt on my property isn't just dirt, it's a brittle, stubborn mix of red clay and limestone that turns to concrete in the August sun and thick, unyielding soup after a heavy rain. My grandfather bought this land in 1952. He pulled rocks out of the ground by hand until his knuckles were permanently swollen, all so he could plant alfalfa and run a few head of cattle. I grew up on the seat of his old Massey Ferguson tractor. Now I'm the only one left. It's just me, an aging rescue mutt named Barnaby, and 40 acres of silence. At least it used to be silent. 5 years ago, a developer bought the sprawling timber lot bordering my south property line. They clear-cut the century-old pines in a matter of weeks. The sound of chainsaws and bulldozers became the new soundtrack to my mornings. Within 2 years, a subdivision erupted from the scarred earth. They called it Whispering Pines, which is the kind of sick joke only a real estate developer could come up with after murdering every pine tree in a 2-mile radius. The houses were massive, sterile boxes, crammed so close together you could hear your neighbors sneeze. And with the houses came the homeowners association. I didn't care what they did on their side of the fence. I really didn't. I had my own life, a small machine shop in my barn where I fixed up old engine blocks and enough distance to pretend the subdivision didn't exist. We were separated by an old, rusting barbed wire fence and a thick tree line that I deliberately let overgrow to block the view of their vinyl-sided McMansions. The peace broke on a Tuesday in late spring. I walked down to my mailbox at the end of the county road and found a crisp, cream-colored envelope waiting for me. The return address was stamped in raised gold foil. Whispering Pines HOA Board of Directors. I opened it leaning against the rusted post of my mailbox. It was a formal citation. A fine for $250. The violation: unkempt outbuildings and failure to adhere to the community's approved exterior color palette. I stared at the letter, feeling a slow, cynical laugh bubble up in my chest. They were trying to find me from my barn. My faded, red, weather-beaten barn that sat on land my family had owned since Harry Truman was in office. I wasn't in their HOA. I wasn't in their subdivision. My property wasn't even technically in the same zoning district. I tossed the letter in the trash and forgot about it. A week later, another one arrived. This time the fine was $500, with a threat to place a lien on my property. That afternoon, I met Brielle Edwards. Barnaby had started barking near the south fence line. It was a frantic, sharp bark, the kind he reserved for stray coyotes. I grabbed a heavy wrench from my workbench, purely out of habit, and walked through the tall grass toward the tree line. There, standing on my side of the rusted barbed wire, was a woman. She wore spotless white tennis shoes, expensive athletic wear that had clearly never seen a gym, and a massive pair of dark sunglasses that shielded half her face. She was holding a clipboard and pointing a manicured finger at my barn. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice carrying over the rustling grass. "You're trespassing." She turned, utterly unfazed. She looked me up and down, taking in my grease-stained jeans and old flannel shirt, and her mouth twisted into a tight, disapproving line. "Are you the owner of this structure?" she asked. Her voice was shrill, carrying a nasal authority that suggested she was used to people immediately doing whatever she told them to. "I'm the owner of the structure, the grass you're standing on, and the fence you just climbed through, now back on the other side." "I am Brielle Edwards," she announced, as if this explained everything. "President of the Whispering Pines HOA. I'm doing a perimeter assessment. Your dilapidated shed is an eyesore. It is driving down the property values of the entire south-facing row of our community." "Did you receive my letters?" "I received your trash," I corrected her, stopping about 10 feet away. "I'm not in your HOA, Brielle. My property line ends at that fence. You have zero jurisdiction here. Now leave. She scoffed, crossing her arms. Jurisdiction is a strong word. The city granted us a visual easement buffer. We have the right to enforce community standards within a reasonable sightline of our development. It's in the bylaws. I rubbed the bridge of my nose, feeling a migraine building behind my eyes. Bylaws apply to people who signed a contract. I didn't. Get off my land. She didn't move. She just stared at me with this hollow, superior expression. We are going to put a line on this land, she said flatly, and when the county forces a sale, we'll buy it and bulldoze that hideous barn ourselves. Good luck with that, I said. Next time you cross the fence, I'm calling the sheriff. She turned and marched back to the fence, carefully stepping between the rusted wires. She didn't look back. I thought that would be the end of it. Just an entitled neighbor with a god complex who didn't understand how property law worked. I was wrong. The letters were just the opening act. 2 weeks after the incident at the fence line, the county road that serviced Whispering Pines underwent a major utility overhaul. The city brought in heavy machinery, tore up the asphalt, and effectively reduced the main entrance of the subdivision to a single, alternating lane governed by a temporary stoplight. During morning and evening rush hours, traffic backed up for half a mile. My property, however, sits at the corner of the development. My long dirt driveway connects directly to the unobstructed county highway, and the back of my east pasture runs parallel to the rear cul-de-sac of Whispering Pines. I was drinking coffee on my porch on a Thursday morning when I saw it. A pristine white Lexus SUV broke through the tree line at the back of my property. I choked on my coffee, standing up so fast my chair tipped backward over the porch boards. The SUV wasn't just driving on my land. It was tearing through my east pasture, a field of delicate native switchgrass and wildflowers I had spent 3 years cultivating to stop soil erosion. The vehicle bounded over the uneven ground, crushing everything in its path, leaving deep, black, muddy ruts in the damp morning soil. It sped across the quarter-mile stretch, swung wide around my barn, and barreled down my dirt driveway, throwing gravel into the air before pulling seamlessly out onto the clear county highway, bypassing the entire construction traffic jam. Through the tinted window, as it blew past my house, I caught a glimpse of the driver. Big sunglasses, blonde hair, Brielle. She had found a shortcut. I walked out to the pasture. The damage was sickening. My grandfather had always taught me to respect the soil. It's the only thing that lasts, Alexios, he'd say. People leave, dirt remains. Seeing those deep, violent gashes torn into the earth felt like a physical blow. The grass was flattened, the soil churned up and exposing raw, wet clay. I drove into town and went straight to the county sheriff's office. I sat in a plastic chair across from Deputy Gary Miller, a guy I went to high school with. He was a good cop, but tired, constantly overworked, dealing with petty disputes in the new developments. I showed him the pictures of the tracks. I explained the letters. I told him about the trespassing. Gary sighed, rubbing his temples. Alexios, I believe you. I know Brielle Edwards. Half the station knows her. She calls us twice a week because someone's garbage cans are out too long, or a teenager looked at her sideways. So arrest her for trespassing, I said, my voice tight. She destroyed my pasture. I can't just go arrest her based on tire tracks, Art. I didn't see her do it. You didn't get it on video. You got a glance through a tinted window. She'll say she was at home. Without proof, it's a civil matter. You'll have to sue her in small claims for the grass. She cut my fence, Gary. How else did she get Alexis through the tree line? Do you see her cut it? I ground my teeth together. No. Then go patch your fence. Put up bigger no trespassing signs. If you catch her in the act on video, call me. Until then, my hands are tied. I drove home simmering in a cold, heavy rage. I walked to the back of the property. Sure enough, the old barbed wire fence had been snipped clean through. The heavy wooden posts on either side had been yanked out of the ground, likely pulled out with a tow strap, creating a gap exactly wide enough for a vehicle. I spent 4 hours that afternoon sinking new, thicker cedar posts. I strung heavy-gauge, high-tensile wire across the gap. I hung 3 bright orange, no trespassing, private property signs directly at eye level. The next morning, I set up a trail camera on the trunk of a nearby oak tree, angling it perfectly to capture the new fence line. Saturday morning, I checked the camera. At 6:15 a.m., Brielle Edwards's white Lexus pulled up to my side of the fence. A man got out, her husband, Richard, a guy who looked exactly like the kind of man who would marry a Brielle. Polo shirt tucked into khaki shorts, boat shoes, wearing an expression of permanent, vague irritation. He didn't even hesitate. He took a pair of heavy bolt cutters out of the trunk, snapped my brand new high-tensile wire like it was string, and tossed the orange signs into the mud. He got back in the car, and Brielle drove straight through, churning up another massive set of ruts right next to the old ones. I took the SD card straight to Gary. Gary watched the video on his computer. He shook his head. Okay, that's criminal mischief and trespassing. I'll go pay them a visit. I waited by my phone all afternoon. When Gary finally called back, he didn't sound victorious. He sounded exhausted. I cited them, Alexios, Gary said. Wrote them tickets for trespassing and destruction of property. Did you arrest them? They're misdemeanors, Art. It's a citation. They have to go to court next month and pay a fine. A fine? I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. Gary, they live in $1 million house. A $300 ticket is the cost of a nice dinner for them. It's an admission fee, it's not a deterrent. It's the law, Gary said quietly. If they do it again, call me. They did it again the very next day. Sunday morning. I was in the barn when I heard the engines. I walked out and watched, helpless, as Brielle's white Lexus came tearing across my pasture. But she wasn't alone. Following right behind her was a silver Range Rover. Behind that, a black BMW SUV. Behind that, a massive, lifted Ford pickup truck. And finally, a cherry red Porsche Cayenne. 5 vehicles. A whole parade of entitlement. Brielle had apparently told her friends about the secret shortcut to bypass the weekend traffic heading out to the lake. They drove right past my barn. As Brielle passed me, she didn't just ignore me. She rolled down her window, slowed down, and smiled. The fine was in the mail, Alexios, she yelled over the engine. Easement rights, see you in court. She sped up, spraying a fountain of wet dirt over my boots. The other 4 cars followed suit, the drivers laughing or looking at their phones, completely indifferent to the fact that they were tearing a 200-foot scar across someone else's life. I stood in the mud, watching their taillights disappear down my driveway. The law wasn't going to fix this. The police couldn't stop them. A judge might slap their wrists in 6 months. But by then, my pasture would be a permanent dirt highway for the HOA. They thought I was just some old hick they could push around. They thought my land was just empty space waiting for them to use it. I looked down at the deep, muddy trenches their tires had carved into my soil. I looked at the dark, heavy clay underneath. An idea began to form. A cold, mechanical, heavily engineered idea. If you've never operated a heavy excavator, it's a terrifying and beautiful experience. The machine is an extension of your own body, translating the slight pull of a joystick into thousands of pounds of hydraulic force. On Monday morning, I didn't call the police. I called a heavy equipment rental company in the next county over. I ordered a mid-sized tracked excavator and a skid steer loader. They delivered them on flatbeds by noon. I had spent Sunday night poring over county zoning laws, agricultural exemptions, and property rights. In our county, if you own more than 20 acres of agricultural land, you don't need a permit to dig a drainage trench or a percolation testing site, provided it's not tapping into a natural waterway and is fully contained within your property lines. I wasn't building a trap. Legally, strictly speaking, I was undertaking an essential agricultural drainage project to manage runoff from the new subdivision. The fact that this drainage project happened to be located exactly where Brielle Edwards and her friends were illegally driving their cars. Just a coincidence. I fired up the excavator. The diesel engine roared to life, a deep, rhythmic thrum that vibrated up through the steel seat and into my chest. I drove the heavy tracks out to the east pasture, positioning the bucket right over the deep, muddy ruts Brielle's tires had left. I dropped the steel teeth into the earth and pulled back. The soil tore open. I dug a trench. But trench is a polite word for it. It was a moat. I made it 12 feet wide, ensuring that even a lifted truck couldn't straddle it. I made it 6 feet deep, cutting past the topsoil, past the heavy clay, all the way down to the loose, rocky subsoil. I didn't just dig one. I dug 5 of them, spaced about 30 feet apart, directly across the path they had charted through my land. The excavated dirt was carefully scooped up by the skid steer and transported to the far side of my property, out of sight. When I was done, my pasture looked like a war zone. 5 massive gaping chasms spanned the width of the clearing. If someone drove a car into one of these, it wouldn't just get stuck, it would drop entirely below ground level. The suspension would snap, the frame would bury itself. It would require a heavy-duty wrecker crane to pull it out, but a giant hole in the ground is obvious. Even Brielle wasn't stupid enough to drive into a 6-foot ditch in broad daylight. I needed them to look like solid ground. This is where the engineering came in. I went to the lumber yard and bought dozens of sheets of cheap 1/4-inch plywood. It was incredibly flimsy, the kind of wood you use for cheap backing on a bookshelf. It couldn't support the weight of a person, let alone a 4,000-pound SUV. I laid a framework of thin pine, strapping across the top of the trenches, just enough to hold the plywood in place. I covered the plywood with a layer of landscaping fabric. Then the meticulous part began. I used the skid steer to carefully spread a thin 2-inch layer of topsoil over the fabric. I matched the contour of the surrounding pasture perfectly. I spent hours on my hands and knees, transplanting clumps of tall switchgrass and weeds from the edges of the property into the thin dirt on top of the plywood. I watered it down so it settled, blending the edges seamlessly into the unbroken pasture on either side. I worked until the sun went down, working by the harsh LED work lights of the tractor. By midnight, I stood back and wiped the grease and sweat from my forehead. It was perfect. To the naked eye, the pasture looked completely normal. The grass swayed in the night breeze. The moonlight reflected off the damp soil. You couldn't tell that beneath that thin illusion of safety lay 6 feet of empty air. I was building sinkholes. Man-made, perfectly camouflaged sinkholes. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep. I sat in the armchair by the window in the dark, watching the tree line, drinking black coffee. I knew their routine now. The utility work on the county road was scheduled to last another month. Tomorrow was Tuesday. Brielle had her weekly HOA board meeting in town at 9 a.m. Sure enough, at 8:30 a.m., the morning sun illuminated the dust kicking up in the Whispering Pines cul-de-sac. Barnaby, asleep on the rug at my feet, lifted his head and let out a low growl. Through the trees, I saw the flash of white paint. It was Brielle's Lexus. And she wasn't alone. I saw the silver Range Rover right on her bumper, then the black BMW, the red Porsche, and a new one, a dark blue Mercedes SUV. 5 cars, the HOA board and their friends, carpooling to town, using my farm as their personal highway. They reached the broken fence line. They didn't slow down. Brielle accelerated, leading the pack, her tires throwing dirt into the air as she hit the open pasture. She was aiming right for my barn, right down the path she had carved before, right toward the first camouflage trench. I stood up, holding my coffee mug so tightly, my knuckles turned white. I didn't breathe. Brielle's Lexus hit the first patch of false ground at 40 miles an hour. For a fraction of a second, the car seemed to glide. Then, physics took over. The 1/4-inch plywood didn't just break, it vaporized under the 2-ton weight of the SUV. There was a sound like a shotgun blast as the wood shattered, followed by a violent, metallic crunch. The front end of the Lexus dropped instantly. The rear wheels flew up into the air, completely leaving the ground. The car slammed nose first into the bottom of the 6-foot trench. A massive cloud of dust, topsoil, and shredded plywood erupted into the morning air. The silver Range Rover, following less than 20 feet behind her, didn't even have time to hit the brakes. The driver swerved violently to avoid the sinking Lexus, tearing off the established path and veering to the right, directly into the second camouflaged trench. Crack. The Range Rover dropped sideways, the entire right side of the vehicle vanishing beneath the earth. The impact blew out both passenger side windows in a shower of tempered glass. The black BMW slammed on its brakes, but they were on wet pasture grass. The heavy SUV skidded out of control, sliding sideways. The driver overcorrected, spinning the wheel, and the back half of the BMW swung around and broke through the third trench. The rear axle snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and the car was wedged at a brutal 45-degree angle, its front tires clawing uselessly at the solid ground while its back end hung in the pit. The driver of the red Porsche panicked. Seeing 3 cars swallowed by the earth, they slammed the vehicle in reverse, flooring the accelerator to back out toward the tree line. They reversed blindly, straight into the 4th trench. The sports SUV dropped backward, its rear bumper smashing into the dirt wall, burying the exhaust pipes deep in the clay. The blue Mercedes, bringing up the rear, stopped just in time. The driver sat there, idling in front of the broken fence, staring in absolute shock at the carnage unfolding in my pasture. Silence descended on the field, a heavy, thick silence, broken only by the hiss of a punctured radiator and the frantic, distant honking of a car alarm. 4 luxury SUVs were buried in my pasture, looking like toys abandoned in a sandbox. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was still hot. I walked out the front door, down the porch steps, and began the long stroll across the field toward the wreckage. Barnaby trotted beside me, his tail wagging. As I got closer, the screaming started. Brielle was trapped in her Lexus. The front end was buried so deep, the doors were wedged against the dirt walls of the trench. She was beating on the window, her face red, her sunglasses knocked askew. I walked right up to the edge of the pit and looked down at her. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just looked at her with the absolute cold detachment of a man inspecting a broken fence post. She rolled down her window, coughing on the dust. "Help me!" she shrieked. "You lunatic, you crazy old man. You tried to kill us." "Good morning, Brielle," I said evenly. "Looks like you drove into my agricultural drainage project." "Drainage project?" she screamed, her voice cracking. "You dug pits. You trapped us." "I dug necessary trenches on my own private property, which you are currently trespassing on," I replied, pulling my phone out of my pocket. "And as it turns out, I'm the one who needs to call the sheriff this time. You're littering in my field." I dialed Gary's number. The HOA drama was just getting started. Deputy Gary Miller arrived exactly 14 minutes after I called him. He parked his cruiser at the top of my dirt driveway and walked the rest of the way down to the pasture. He didn't rush. He took slow, measured steps, his thumbs hooked into his duty belt, his eyes shielded by aviator sunglasses. He stopped at the edge of the first trench and stared. He looked at the white Lexus nose down in the dirt. He looked at the shattered Range Rover, the suspended BMW, and the wedged Porsche. Then he looked at me. "Alexios," Gary said. His voice was completely devoid of inflection. "What am I looking at?" "Agricultural drainage," I replied, handing him a printed stack of papers. "County Code Section 402, Paragraph B, unpermitted earthworks for the management of runoff on agricultural land exceeding 20 acres. I've been having a terrible time with the water pooling here since they paved over the timber lot next door." Gary took the papers. He looked down into the pit where Brielle was still screaming, pounding her fists against the steering wheel. Her husband Richard was pacing near the broken fence line, yelling into his cell phone. "You dug sinkholes, Art." "I dug trenches," I corrected him mildly. "They drove into them. I even put up safety covers to keep the deer out, but unfortunately, a 1/4-inch sheet of plywood isn't rated for suburban vehicular traffic." Gary exhaled a long, heavy breath through his nose. He walked over to the edge of the pit. "Ma'am," he called down to Brielle, "are you injured?" "Arrest him," she shrieked, her voice echoing out of the clay pit. "Look at my car. Look at my beautiful car. He's a psychopath." "Are you injured, Mrs. Edwards?" Gary repeated a little louder. "No, I'm trapped. The doors won't open." "Well, you wedge a frame between two walls of solid dirt. That's what happens," Gary said casually. He turned back to me. "All right, Art. Let's get them out." It took the fire department to get Brielle out. They had to drop a ladder down the side of the trench and pry her sunroof open with a crowbar. She emerged covered in red clay dust, her hair a wild, tangled mess, one of her expensive white tennis shoes missing entirely. The drivers of the other vehicles, two women in tennis skirts and a terrified-looking man in a golf polo, were helped out of their respective wrecks. They stood in a huddled, miserable group near the property line, glaring at me like I was the devil incarnate. Once everyone was safely on solid ground, Gary pulled out his citation book. "What are you doing?" Richard demanded, stomping over. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "You should be putting that lunatic in handcuffs. This is attempted murder." "This is private property, Mr. Edwards," Gary said, clicking his pen. "Property you and your wife have already been formally trespassed from. Mr. Smith here has the right to dig a hole on his land. You do not have the right to drive your wife's Lexus into it." He wrote 5 separate citations for criminal trespass. He handed the first one to Brielle. She snatched it from his hand, her face a mottled, furious purple. "I am going to sue you for everything you own," she hissed at me, her voice trembling with a rage so pure it almost commanded respect. "I am going to take this land, bulldoze your grandfather's rotting barn, and pave a driveway right over your living room. Get your cars off my property by sundown," I told her, my voice quiet, "or I'll have them sold for scrap." Getting them out was a spectacle all its own. Standard tow trucks couldn't do the job. You can't just hook a winch to a car sitting in a 6-foot hole. The angle is wrong. You'll just drag the front bumper off into the dirt. They had to call a specialized heavy wrecker service from the city, the kind they used to pull overturned semi-trucks out of ditches. The rotator crane arrived at noon. It was a massive, roaring beast of a machine. The operator charged a $2,000 call-out fee plus $500 an hour per vehicle. And because it was an off-road recovery on private property, insurance wasn't going to cover a dime of it. I sat on my porch with Barnaby, drinking iced tea, and watched the show. The crane operator had to strap the Lexus by its axles and hoist it straight up into the air, completely vertically, before swinging it over to solid ground. The sound of the frame groaning under the tension echoed across the 40 acres. The front bumper tore completely off. The suspension was shot. The radiator dumped neon green coolant all over my dirt. It took 5 hours. By the time the last car, the red Porsche, was dragged out of its tomb, the sun was sitting low and heavy on the horizon. The vehicles were loaded onto a convoy of flatbeds. They looked like casualties of a strange, suburban war. Brielle and Richard stood by the broken fence line until the bitter end. Before she got into the cab of the tow truck to leave, she locked eyes with me across the field. She didn't scream this time. She just stared. It was a cold, calculating look. The battle in the pasture was over. But as I watched the tow trucks rumble away, leaving 5 massive, empty pits in my field, I knew the war was just beginning. Silence didn't return to the farm. Instead, the quiet was replaced by the low, persistent hum of institutional harassment. When people like Brielle Edwards realize they can't bully you directly, they don't give up. They just change tactics. They weaponize the system. They have the time, the money, and the absolute, unwavering belief that the world is built to serve them. It started 3 days after the tow trucks left. I was in the barn, rebuilding the carburetor on an old Ford tractor, when a white county fleet vehicle pulled up the driveway. A man in a high-visibility vest stepped out, carrying a tablet. He introduced himself as an inspector for the Department of Environmental Quality. "We received an anonymous tip," he said, looking uncomfortably at my grease-stained hands. "An allegation that you are improperly storing and disposing of hazardous chemicals, specifically motor oil and hydraulic fluid, which is allegedly leaching into the groundwater." I wiped my hands on a rag. An anonymous tip from a woman with blonde hair and a lot of free time. He cleared his throat. "I still have to inspect the premises, Mr. Smith." I let him. I had nothing to hide. I kept my waste oil in sealed, double-walled steel drums and paid a recycling company to haul it away twice a year. The inspector spent 2 hours poking around my barn, my shed, and my tractors. He found nothing. He apologized and left. The next day, it was county code enforcement. The complaint alleged my barn was structurally unsound and posed a collapse hazard to the neighboring subdivision. The inspector, a tired woman who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, measured the distance from the barn to the property line. "It's 400 feet from the fence, Alexios," she sighed, checking off a box on her clipboard. "Even if it blew up, it wouldn't reach them. I'll close the file." Then came animal control. Report of a vicious unleashed dog menacing children through the fence, the officer told me. We both looked down at Barnaby. He was currently lying on his back in the sun, snoring softly, one paw twitching as he dreamed about chasing rabbits. The officer petted him for 5 minutes, gave him a biscuit, and drove away. It was a siege by 1,000 paper cuts. Every other day, there was a new truck in my driveway. A new inspector. A new certified letter. They sent a drone over my property. I heard it buzzing like a giant angry mosquito one afternoon. I walked out and saw it hovering 50 feet above my house, a little white quadcopter with a camera pointed directly into my backyard. I didn't shoot it down. That's a federal crime. Surprisingly enough, instead, I grabbed my grandfather's old spotlight from the barn. It was a 1,000,000 candle power halogen lamp we used to use for spotlighting coyotes. I plugged it into a heavy-duty extension cord, walked out to the yard, and aimed the beam directly into the drone's camera lens. The screen of whoever was piloting it must have gone completely white. The drone wobbled violently, lost its orientation, and drifted right into the upper branches of my oldest oak tree. I heard the satisfying crack of plastic propellers shattering, followed by a dull thud as it hit the dirt. I scooped it up with a shovel and tossed it into the nearest garbage can. But the harassment was taking its toll, not physically, but mentally. It's exhausting to constantly defend your own existence. To wake up every morning, wondering what fabricated emergency you have to deal with today. One evening, about 2 weeks into the siege, I was sitting on the porch. The sun was going down, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the pasture. The 5 trenches were still there, stark and open, a reminder of the violence. A shadow moved at the end of the driveway. I stood up, keeping one hand resting on the porch railing near the heavy iron tire iron I kept there. But it wasn't an inspector, it was Richard Edwards. He was dressed down, jeans and a button-up shirt, looking out of place in the fading country light. He walked up the dirt path alone, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Smith," he called out, stopping about 20 feet from the porch. "Edwards, you're trespassing again." "I'm not looking for a fight," he said, holding up a hand. He looked tired. The permanent irritation on his face had been replaced by a kind of weary resignation. "Can I come up?" I didn't say yes, but I didn't tell him to leave. He took that as permission and walked up to the bottom step of the porch. "Brielle's out of her mind over this," Richard said softly, looking out over the field. The Lexus was totaled. Frame damage from the drop, water damage from the busted radiator sitting in the clay. Insurance denied the claim because she was technically committing a crime when it happened. We're out 80 grand. "Sounds like an expensive shortcut," I said. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "She won't let it go, Alexios. She's got the HOA lawyers looking into adverse possession laws. She's got the city council on speed dial. She is going to make your life a living hell until you break or you die." "Is this a threat, Richard?" "It's a fact," he said, looking up at me. "I know how she operates. She doesn't lose. She just grinds people down into dust." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded piece of heavy paper. He handed it to me. "This is an offer," he said, "from a holding company I control. It's for the land. The house, the barn, the whole 40 acres. It's 20% over market value, cash. We close in 30 days. I took the paper but didn't open it. I looked at the crisp, clean edges. You take the money, you buy a nice place out in the country, away from subdivisions and HOAs. Richard continued, his voice taking on the smooth, persuasive cadence of a salesman. "You retire. We get the land. We expand Whispering Pines, and this whole ugly mess goes away." I looked past him, out toward the darkening pasture. My grandfather used to walk that fence line every Sunday. He knew the shape of every rock. He knew which patches of soil yielded the best alfalfa. When he died, we scattered his ashes under the oak tree, where Brielle's drone was currently rotting in the trash. This dirt wasn't an investment to me. It was an anchor. It was the only proof I had that my family had ever existed. "Richard," I said softly, my voice barely carrying over the chirping of the crickets. "Yeah? Did you know that before this was a subdivision, it was a timber lot?" He frowned, confused. "Sure, so. Before that, in the late 1800s, it was a marsh, a deep, nasty peat bog. When they built the timber lot, they had to truck in thousands of tons of fill dirt just to make the ground stable enough to plant trees." "I don't see what this has to do with my offer, Alexios." I looked down at him. "It means your $1 million houses are built on a sponge. It means the only reason your streets aren't flooded every spring is because the natural drainage slope of this entire quadrant runs downhill, right across my east pasture." Richard stared at me. The crickets seemed to get louder. "I rejected your wife's authority," I said, finally tearing the crisp offer letter cleanly in half, and then in half again. "I didn't reject the concept of community standards. In fact, I've been doing a lot of reading on water management." I let the torn pieces of paper flutter out of my hand, falling like snow onto the dirt driveway. "Get off my land, Richard, and tell Brielle to buy some rain boots." The next morning I called the equipment rental yard and told them I needed the excavator for another week. I didn't tell Richard Edwards to buy rain boots just to hear myself talk. I had spent hours poring over county topographical maps, historical soil surveys, and state agricultural water management codes. Whispering Pines sat in a geographical bowl. For 100 years, the only thing keeping that land from turning back into a stagnant peat bog was the natural, gentle slope that allowed rainwater to sheet across my 40 acres and eventually drain into the county creek 2 miles away. When the developers built the subdivision, they stripped the deep-rooted trees that absorbed the moisture and laid down miles of non-porous asphalt. They calculated their stormwater drainage based on the assumption that my land would always be there to act as their overflow sponge. But according to state law, an agricultural landowner is well within their rights to capture and retain surface runoff for irrigation and livestock watering. In fact, the state encourages it. They even offer tax incentives for building retention ponds. I fired up the excavator. I didn't fill the 5 trenches I had dug to trap Brielle's convoy. Instead, I connected them. I spent 4 12-hour days moving earth. I dug a massive, sweeping trench parallel to the broken fence line, stripping away the topsoil and exposing the thick, watertight red clay beneath. I piled the excavated dirt on my side of the trench, packing it down with the heavy steel tracks of the machine to form a solid, impenetrable berm 4 feet high and 6 feet thick. I was building a dam, a completely legal, heavily engineered agricultural retention basin that just happened to span the entire southern border of Whispering Pines. But the harassment from the HOA didn't stop while I worked. They called the police twice to complain about the noise of the heavy machinery. Gary Miller drove out both times, parked at the end of my driveway, watched me dig for 10 minutes, and drove away without even getting out of his cruiser. He knew better now. By the end of the week, the earthworks were finished. My east pasture now featured a dry, empty basin, capable of holding hundreds of thousands of gallons of water, backed by a fortified clay wall that essentially severed the subdivision's natural drainage route. I seeded the berm with fast-growing rye to stabilize the soil, parked the excavator, and waited. Late September in this part of the country brings the autumn storms. They roll in from the west, dragging heavy, bruised clouds that sit low over the horizon and dump water for days on end. The first storm hit on a Tuesday. It started as a slow, drumming drizzle against the tin roof of my barn. By nightfall, it was a torrential downpour. The wind howled through the skeletal branches of the oak trees, and the ground quickly turned soft and saturated. I sat on the porch, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, a cup of black coffee in my hand. Barnaby pressed his warm side against my leg, shivering slightly at the claps of thunder. I watched the tree line. As the rain pounded the asphalt of whispering pines, the water behaved exactly as gravity dictated. It rushed down the gutters, flooded the storm drains, and sheeted across the perfectly manicured lawns of the cul-de-sac, seeking the lowest point of elevation. It flowed right through the tree line, across the property boundary, and into my new basin. For the first few hours, it worked perfectly. The basin filled slowly, the red clay bottom holding the water tight. But the rain didn't stop, it rained all through Wednesday. By Thursday morning, the local news was issuing flash flood warnings. I pulled on my rubber muck boots and a heavy slicker and walked out to the pasture. The grass was slick and dangerous. When I reached the berm, I climbed to the top and looked over. The basin was full. A muddy, brown lake now sat on the edge of my property, lapping gently against the top of the clay wall. And because the water could no longer flow across my pasture, it had nowhere else to go. I looked through the thinning trees toward the Whispering Pines cul-de-sac. The streets were gone. A sheet of dark, standing water stretched across the asphalt, creeping up the concrete driveways of the million-dollar homes. The meticulously planted flower beds were submerged. Expensive landscaping bark floated down the street like driftwood. A blue garbage can drifted lazily past Brielle Edwards's front porch. The water was backing up. The subdivision's drainage system, deprived of its natural outflow, had completely failed. The sponge was saturated. The bog was reclaiming its territory. I stood in the pouring rain, water running off the brim of my hat, and watched the chaos unfold. Garage doors opened and panicked residents waded out into knee-deep water, trying to move their luxury cars to higher ground. I saw Richard Edwards standing on his porch, a golf umbrella held uselessly over his head, staring at the lake that used to be his front yard. Then, the front door of the Edwards house swung open and Brielle stepped out. She wasn't wearing white tennis shoes today. She was wearing knee-high rubber boots. She waded down her driveway, the water sloshing around her calves, her face tight with a frantic, helpless anger. She pushed through the flooded tree line and marched up to the edge of the water separating us. "Smith," she screamed over the sound of the rain. "What did you do?" "Collecting rainwater, Brielle," I yelled back, leaning comfortably on a wooden fence post I had driven into the top of the berm. "Going to use it to irrigate the alfalfa next spring. You're flooding my neighborhood. My basement has 3 inches of water in it." "Sounds like you have a structural issue with your foundation. You should probably call the developer." "Tear this down," she demanded, pointing a shaking finger at the clay wall. "Tear it down right now, or I swear to God, I will have you arrested for destruction of property." I laughed, a real, deep laugh that felt good in my chest. "You can't trespass water, Brielle," I told her. "Gravity doesn't care about your HOA bylaws, and neither do I." I turned my back on her, walked down the berm, and headed back to the dry warmth of my house. The city engineer arrived on Friday morning. The rain had finally stopped, leaving a heavy, humid stillness over the valley. He parked his truck on the county road and waded through the mud of the cul-de-sac, accompanied by Brielle, Richard, and 3 other furious HOA board members. Today, they stood on their side of the property line, staring at the massive retention pond, holding back millions of gallons of water. I met them at the fence. "Mr. Smith," the engineer said, looking at a rolled-up topographical map. He looked exhausted. His boots were caked in mud. "Mrs. Edwards alleges you have illegally dammed a natural waterway and flooded a residential zone." "It's not a waterway," I said calmly. "It's surface runoff, and according to my approved agricultural exemption, filed with the County Water Management District 3 weeks ago, I am permitted to retain surface runoff for irrigation." I handed him a copy of the stamped paperwork. The engineer reviewed the document. He looked at the berm. He looked at the flooded subdivision. He let out a long, slow whistle. "He's right," the engineer said, turning to Brielle. Brielle's mouth dropped open. "What do you mean he's right? Look at my street. The water is stagnant. It stinks. You have to order him to bulldoze that wall." "I can't," the engineer said simply. "He's operating within state agricultural guidelines. He owns the land. He owns the runoff once it hits his dirt. The county approved the earthworks." "So what are we supposed to do?" Richard yelled, losing his temper for the first time. The engineer rolled up his map. "You're going to have to install a forced pumping drainage system. Trench the streets, lay high-capacity pipes, and pump the water uphill to the municipal storm sewer on the North Highway. It's going to be a massive civil engineering project." "How much?" Richard asked, his voice suddenly very quiet. The engineer scratched his chin. "For a subdivision this size, to retrofit a forced main system, easily $2, maybe $3 million. The silence that followed was absolute. $3 million. The HOA didn't have $3 million. They had a reserve fund for painting the neighborhood entrance sign and hiring lawyers to harass old farmers. To raise $3 million, they would have to issue a massive special assessment. Every homeowner in Whispering Pines would be hit with a bill for $50,000 or $60,000, payable immediately." I looked at Brielle. The color had completely drained from her face. The tyrannical, untouchable president of the HOA was gone. In her place was just a very tired, very wet woman, realizing she had picked a fight with the earth itself, and she had lost. "You did this on purpose," she whispered, staring at me. "I managed my land," I replied. "You should learn to manage yours." The fallout was swift and brutal. The special assessment was announced the following month. The neighborhood revolted. Lawsuits flew, but not at me. The homeowners sued the HOA board. They sued the original developer for failing to disclose the floodplain risk. Brielle Edwards was recalled as president in a unanimous, highly hostile vote. By spring, the for sale signs started popping up like weeds. But nobody wanted to buy $1 million house sitting on a swamp with a pending $60,000 tax assessment. Property values plummeted. Brielle and Richard moved away in late May. I watched the moving trucks load up their pristine furniture from my porch. She never looked my way. She just got into her replacement car, a very sensible, low-clearance sedan, and drove out of Whispering Pines for the last time. The city eventually stepped in, forcing the installation of the pumping system to prevent a public health hazard. The construction tore up the subdivision's roads for a year, replacing the quiet suburban utopia with the roar of jackhammers and diesel engines. But on my side of the fence, things returned to normal. The spring sun baked the mud back into hard, unyielding dirt. The alfalfa came in thick and green, fed by the deep reserve of water in my retention pond. Barnaby went back to sleeping in the tall grass, completely unbothered by the noise of the pumps next door. I walked the fence line one evening in June, trailing my fingers along the rough, rusted barbed wire. I stood at the edge of the east pasture, looking out over the land my grandfather had cleared by hand. People think power is about money, or titles, or the ability to write a citation. But true power is older than that. True power is patience. It's understanding the ground beneath your feet. People come and go. They build their fragile boxes, they enforce their petty rules, and they eventually fade away. But the dirt remains. There's a lesson here about respect. When you mistake someone's quiet nature for weakness, you might just find out they're so simply waiting for the right moment to let the ground open up beneath you. If you've ever had to deal with an entitled neighbor, an overstepping HOA, or someone who thought they could walk all over you, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that patience always wins in the end. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of sweet, absolute revenge. I'll see you in the next one.